This photo is said to show what a person looks like after going 30 days without sleep. Throughout human history, we've conducted many terrifying experiments. Today, we're going to talk about one related to sleep. In a previous video, we mentioned that sleep is actually an almost supernatural ability of advanced life forms. If humans go just one day without sleep, inflammation immediately starts building up in the body. The longest recorded time without sleep belongs to an American, Randy Gardner. In 1963, he stayed awake for 11 days and 25 minutes, which is about 264 hours. That's insane. But even those 11 days nearly killed him. By the later stages of the experiment, he had almost lost his ability to speak, suffered severe cognitive impairment, major memory loss, and his mind was filled with hallucinations and delusions. So what would happen if someone were completely deprived of sleep and forced to stay awake non-stop? At the time, many countries were researching this because they believed that if workers could work endlessly, productivity would skyrocket. And if soldiers never had to sleep, they'd gain overwhelming combat power in war. So, to find out, the Soviet Union reportedly conducted a secret experiment in 1940. The goal was to break humanity free from the limits of sleep. Researchers found 5 death row inmates and locked them in a sealed room, telling them that whoever could stay awake for 30 days would regain their freedom. When they heard this, the prisoners were excited. More than anyone, they wanted freedom. If the choice was death or 30 days without sleep, they didn't hesitate to choose the latter. In their minds, anything had to be easier than dying. But they were wrong. Some might ask, how could you make sure they really didn't fall asleep? If someone was exhausted, how could you stop them? Well, that wasn't a problem, because inside the sealed room, researchers continuously released a nerve gas that kept their bodies in a hyper-alert state. No matter how tired they were, they couldn't fall asleep. The room itself wasn't that bad. There was enough food for 5 people for 30 days, plus books and playing cards, simple entertainment so they wouldn't be too bored. There were no beds, of course, since sleeping wasn't allowed. The room was filled with microphones and speakers, so observers outside could clearly hear everything inside. But the prisoners could only communicate outward using a single microphone mounted on one wall. There was also a massive one-way mirror, allowing researchers to see inside while the prisoners couldn't see out. This allowed constant observation and recording. During the first few days, everything seemed normal. The prisoners were energetic, thinking, as long as we survive 30 days, we'll be free. They cooperated fully, chatting, reading, playing cards. But things started to change around day 5. By then, the biggest difference was that they stopped talking to each other. Each person became silent, and observers noticed their moods growing unstable. They were filled with complaints, venting and ranting. One by one, they fought for the microphone, and when they got it, they'd complain to the outside world about how awful the room was, or what was wrong with the others. It was like they turned the microphone into a kind of emotional outlet. The pressure was just too much. The researchers concluded that if they didn't speak into the microphone, they could barely even feel their own existence. By the end of the first week, things got much worse. Everyone's mental state collapsed rapidly. Their eyes were bloodshot, dark circles deep, and even when standing still, their hands twitched uncontrollably. One prisoner broke first. He began running wildly in circles and occasionally used the microphone to make strange sounds. The noise was neither crying nor laughing. To anyone who didn't know better, it wouldn't even sound human. Meanwhile, the others weren't idle either. They began obsessively writing journals, non-stop, but not about daily life, only filled with paranoia and suspicion. Some began believing this wasn't an experiment at all, but a cruel form of execution meant to kill them slowly. They thought that even if they lasted 30 days, they'd never really be freed. One prisoner even believed that behind the one-way mirror weren't researchers, but paying spectators. At this point, Although things were going badly, the situation was still manageable. But that wouldn't last. On day 19, one prisoner completely snapped. He began screaming hysterically at the top of his lungs. There were no words, just endless screaming. As he screamed, he smashed his head into the wall, tore out his own hair, and ripped apart his clothes. It was clear he was in unimaginable agony. After screaming non-stop for 3 hours, his vocal cords were destroyed, and he could no longer make a sound. But here's the strange part. During those 3 hours, the other 4 prisoners acted as if they couldn't hear him at all. They didn't react, didn't stop him, didn't even complain about the noise. Nothing. At this point, researchers believed everyone's mind was flooded with hallucinations. They literally couldn't perceive his screams anymore. By day 15, a second prisoner began screaming uncontrollably. Among the remaining prisoners, 2 suddenly began tearing apart books, ripping out every page. Then they did something disgusting. They smeared the pages with their own feces and plastered them over the one-way observation glass. It was as if they didn't want the outside world to see what was about to happen inside. Since this was the 1940s, surveillance technology wasn't advanced, so there were no cameras in the room. Once the glass was covered, no one outside could see anything. But the data showed they were still alive because researchers had installed an oxygen level monitoring system. By checking whether oxygen levels dropped, they could tell if people were breathing. And surprisingly, not only were they alive, they were extremely active because oxygen consumption was far higher than normal. After a long time with no visual contact, the research team feared something had gone wrong and requested permission from the military to open the door and check inside. The military quickly approved. Before opening the door, they shut off the nerve gas and replaced it with fresh air. But just before the door opened, one prisoner suddenly spoke into the microphone, calmly and softly. "Don't come in. We don't want to be released." The people outside didn't understand, but they opened the door anyway. And when they finally entered the room, what they saw horrified them. One of the 5 prisoners was already dead and in a horrific state. His organs were scattered across the floor, large chunks of flesh had been torn from his body, and those pieces were clogging the drain. The remaining prisoners had changed drastically in appearance, just like the photo shown at the beginning. Sunken eye sockets, tight, shriveled skin, sharpened teeth. They looked terrifying, like some kind of monsters. And in their mouths, there were still pieces of flesh. If nothing else, it clearly belonged to the dead man. Their condition was so bizarre that researchers couldn't even tell whether they were alive or dead. When the researchers tried to examine them further, the creatures suddenly attacked. One soldier had a huge chunk of flesh torn from his neck, blood pouring everywhere. Just as the soldiers prepared to open fire, all the microphones in the room suddenly broadcast a strange command: lock all researchers involved in the experiment inside. The researchers were terrified. They realized the experiment had gone beyond anything humans could control, and that everyone who witnessed it was meant to disappear. As the soldiers were about to carry out the order, one researcher suddenly grabbed a gun and began shooting the remaining creatures. As he was about to kill the last one, the creature spoke in a strange voice. "Just a little longer, and we could have stayed awake forever." After saying this, the researcher pulled the trigger. After killing all the subjects, he turned the gun on himself. This is the so-called Russian sleep deprivation experiment of 1940. Over time, many versions of this story have circulated with all kinds of variations, but after analysis by experts, it's very likely this never actually happened and was completely fabricated, more like an urban legend because many of the details are far too dramatic. Still, whether true or not, one thing is certain. In the 1940s, many superpowers really did conduct extreme experiments like this, and they all proved one thing: sleep is absolutely vital to human survival. It's not just a habit or routine, but a fundamental safeguard for life itself. You simply cannot go without it. But from another perspective, sleep almost feels like a limitation on humanity. No matter how smart you are, no matter how capable, your energy is still finite. If you are deprived of sleep even briefly, your memory, thinking ability, judgment, and even consciousness itself can be drastically altered. It's like a genjutsu in Naruto. It attacks your mind, and once your mind collapses, your body follows. Maybe someday in the future, humans will use advanced technology to break free from the limits of sleep and stay awake for long periods. If that happens, could human civilization accelerate dramatically?